Your goal is to take the good from others and try to make that part of yourself. Don't change yourself, but add that to your toolkit or your quiver to make yourself a better leader. When in doubt, very simple, underreact. People ask, well, what does the director of the Lockheed Martin Center for Innovation do? And I go, actually, nothing. I just make sure everyone else does something, and it was good.
Welcome to Leading to Profit. I'm your host, Kevin Bees, and I've dedicated my career to empowering business leaders like you with the leadership skills, performance psychology they need to build thriving businesses. Are you ready for immediately actionable strategies from world-class profit leaders? Let's dive in. This is Leading to Profit. Welcome back to episode number 265 of Leading to Profit. Now, earlier in my career, I was a coach on Tony Robbins' coaching team. Now, I'm occasionally asked about how do you get onto a team like that? And I explained to people like the process to get onto his team was like the TV show The Apprentice, but on steroids. Now, apparently they had thousands of applications to join the coaching team, and they whittled it down to 50 of us, and they put us on a 3-month-long telephone interview process. So several times a week, we were jumping on a group call, and they would be calling us out, live on the spot to coach someone on the spot, or ask us questions to make sure we knew something. They had a term there. It was like be unreasonable, right? If you want to have success in life, Tony has high standards. You've got to be something to be unreasonable to get the results that you want. So they would send us programs to listen to. And normally these programs would be, things you would take 90 days, to go through. But they gave us 2 days to get through the programs. Even though we had our, full-time roles that we were already doing and other things going on in life, we had to find the time to fit this in and do this because they want to call on us live on these calls to prove that we knew it. And anyway, I came through the other side of that telephone interview process, and it took 30 of us along to a 10-day live interview process in Chicago. Now, when I got there, I was greeted by the other applicants to the program, and there included people on there like the Admiral of the US Navy, a Nobel Prize winner, someone who was teaching psychology at Harvard Business School. There were CEOs, CFOs, marathon runners, triathletes, like you name it. It was a who's who of achievers, and me. Now, thankfully, I came through that process and I got to work on Tony's team. And I told him I had capacity to work with maybe 35 clients, given my other work that I was doing and my own business. And then the next day I had 70 in my inbox. So my coaching journey and coaching trajectory, I learned a lot very quickly and got very skilled at coaching in that period of time. Now, why is this story relevant to today's episode? The reason is because the guest on today's show is someone I met during that process. Okay. His name is Gregory M. Nosal. Now, Greg served in the United States Navy for 32 years, and he retired as the Rear Admiral of the Navy. So a very distinguished position. He got to serve under different US presidents. And during his career, he flew carrier-based tactical aircraft, participating in Operations Desert Storm, enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom. And following his naval career, he also served as a director of the innovation at Lockheed Martin. Now, I have the privilege of calling this man my friend and my colleague, and he has a wealth of experience in leadership. Given his position in the Navy and serving at the level they did, and working in a large organization, Lockheed Martin, he's got a value to share with us today. Now, he's retired. He spends his time now, with his beautiful family and grandchildren, and doing things like learning the piano. But he's taking time out of retirement right now to come and share with us some fantastic insights on leadership and how we can lead more effectively. So I'm really excited to jump into this episode today. And Greg, welcome to the show. So Greg, is a real honor to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Kevin. It's good to see you again. It's been a long time, and I'm honored to be on your show. And hopefully we'll have a good time this day and share some good stories and some good camaraderie.
I know we will. And I shared in the intro that we had the honor of meeting, at the Tony Robbins interview process, which was a bit of a gauntlet that we had there. And you were very humble because I think not knowing, military, and not knowing Navy, I didn't actually know what an admiral was. And I think I said to you, oh, what's an admiral? And you're very, very modest. And you said something like, oh, I have a few toys and I get to look after a few people. But for people listening, what is an admiral? What did you do in your years in the Navy?
Well, I was very fortunate to spend 32 years in the United States Navy. And I was in a long time, so that means I was kind of old, and I got to be an admiral. And obviously there's a lot of work to get to that position, and had a lot of leadership positions along the way and some staff jobs along the way. And then eventually, if you one are fortunate and sometimes lucky and continue to advance, you'll turn out to be an admiral. And again, there's different levels of leadership in the military hierarchy. In terms of I was a squadron commander of an F-18 squadron, which if you look over my shoulder, you'll see the F-18 there. And then was fortunate enough to command a F-18 training squadron, where if you, Kevin Bees, wanted to learn to be an F-18 pilot, you come to the squadron and we'll teach you how to do it. And then fortunate enough to command an air wing, which is in charge of all the airplanes on an aircraft carrier. And then my last command as an admiral or a flag officer was the commander of a carrier strike group, the USS George H.W. Bush, and the ship and all the planes on it and the people, and also all the ships and occasionally a submarine that came with it. And, people always ask you ask, what's an admiral and what's it like to be an admiral? It was a great job, for a couple of reasons. Number one, you have a lot of really cool toys to play with, and you work with a lot of great people. And last but not least is everybody is really nice to you. So it's a great gig if you can get it. And I was fortunate enough to serve and made numerous deployments, and was able to retire as a flag officer or as a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy.
It's remarkable. And now tell me about that. You mentioned the F-18 behind you. So of course you're a pilot yourself. Tell us about your passion and how much you enjoyed flying during your career as well.
Oh, thanks. Great question. I'm not sure how much time we have today, Kevin, but that one may take, about an hour to talk about, but we'll keep it, slim.
I'm in.
Yeah. Well, it's the old joke. How'd that go? Got to be careful here telling jokes. It's, what's it like about, your first date with a naval aviator? Okay. Half of it is, okay, enough about me. Now let's talk about flying. So I've never met an aviator that isn't interested in flying. Always wanted to fly when I was a young person. My dad was in the United States Air Force, so we grew up on Air Force bases, and seriously considered going to the United States Air Force Academy and being a Air Force pilot. But somebody once said a lot of people can land on a long, 10,000-foot runway. Not everybody can land on a ship at night, that is rolling and moving around, and it's really dark. And so I thought that was a great challenge, and I wanted to do that. And I was fortunate enough to be able to fly. A lot of that, particularly when I was flying, was you needed good health, particularly your eyes. And I was very fortunate to have a good vision. And I got to fly single-seat airplanes, flew A-7s first, and then primarily F-18s, which is a single-seat fighter, which is behind me. A fighter attack, meaning it does the air-to-air mission, but also the air-to-ground mission. And did that for a majority of my 32 years in the Navy, and got to fly on and off of aircraft carriers.
Amazing. And tell us about the leadership aspect, because you explained that you grew up through the different roles and ascended to being the Royal Admiral. What were some key insights that you learned along the way about helping manage people and get the best out of them?
Yeah, great question. The first rule of leadership, and I think sometimes, good leaders know this, but the first rule of good leadership is taking care of your people, is knowing your people, empowering them, trusting them, listening to them, rewarding them when it's appropriate, counseling them if it's also when it's appropriate, and terminating them if it's required, holding them accountable. And so I was very, very fortunate when I started out as a young junior officer. Early in my career, I worked for some really, really good leaders. I remember, and I still do a little mentoring, and I tell young people is that, when you come across somebody, I recommend you make some notes, write down some of the good things that you learned about this leader, or also some of the not so good things. And I kept a journal of all of my commanding officers and some of the good things they did and some of the things that I didn't understand. And I found out as I was progressing and became in some of those same positions, I would look at that list and I'm going, I remember when he did this, 15 years ago, and I thought it was the worst thing ever. So I'm not going to do that. Or I remember when he did this 15 years ago, And I did not understand it back then. And so I found that very valuable. And again, I had great commanding officers. And like I said, I would try to take notes and pay attention. And even to this day, I stay in touch with many of them, who I am very grateful for their mentorship going forward. And, any good leader, and I think you see that with the people you talk to, your goal is, to take the good from others and try to make that part of yourself. Don't change yourself, but add that to your toolkit or your quiver to make yourself a better leader.
Beautiful, beautiful insight. And yeah, take that good from others and add it to your arsenal. And I think the important thing there then is, take care of the people you have around you. But I love this idea of taking notes around, what was really great, what stood out about that person, and what you can learn. So I think that's really fantastic. Now, in terms of the leadership, you no doubt have been in some situations where emotions can run high, or they can be very, probably not even metaphorically, like life or death situations, very high stakes situations. What have you learned along the way around like managing your emotions and dealing with those situations?
Yeah, great question. And, again, I was fortunate enough to work for people, and I'll sum it up pretty simply is that when in doubt, Kevin, underreact if you can. And I don't think that's normal. I remember when I was my first commanding officer tour of an F-18 squadron, and I was in my last day of command. The next morning was going to have a change of command ceremony, and I was leaving, and the guy who was going to take over for me, and I'm in my office and I'm writing my remarks, for the next day. I get to speak, for about 10 minutes, and I'm writing about our squadron because we were fortunate enough. Like I said, we had some great people and we're recognized as the best F-18 squadron in the Navy. And I'm, very successful, very safe tour. And as I'm in my office, a young junior officer comes, knocks on my door, and he goes, "Hey, Skipper, Loogie," great call sign. Loogie's in an F-18 and he's training about 80 miles south of here, and he just took a bird down the engine. And I'm going, uh-oh. And so I'm kind of looking at my remarks, and I go, I may have to change that line. I may have to change this line over my speech. and so I finish up, and the guy, I'm walking down to the ready room. If you remember from Top Gun, where everyone kind of sits around and talks. And somebody told me, "Hey, Skipper," which is what they call the commanding officer, is Loogie has shut down his left engine, which the bird went down, and his right engine, because the F-18 has two engines, isn't working very well either. And I'm going, okay. And so as I get into the ready room, and I walk in, and I'm the commanding officer, and I look around, and the duty officer is on the radio talking to the pilot and his wingman who is escorting him back, and somebody else is calling the base tower to have the crash crew ready, and somebody else is calling to make sure the helicopter is, ready to launch in case they have to eject out of his damaged airplane. And as I'm watching this, and again, I'm the commanding officer, I'm in charge, I'm responsible, I got that. I sat down in a chair and I put my legs up, my feet up on the table. And I just kind of sat back and just crossed my arms. And I remember thinking, I could jump in on this, but one, I don't have to, because all these great professionals were already very trained and they already had it. And they didn't need me, to get involved, to kind of, to make, throw more panic into the situation. And I just remember just sitting there and watching and being very, very proud of our team, of how they handled that. And it was so cool, Kevin, to see that. And make a long story short, Loogie ended up coming back with only one engine and lowered the arresting hook and, caught the wire, and his wingman landed, and, all was good and fair. And the next morning, for the change of command, our guest speaker was the United States Navy's Chief of Naval Operations, which is the number one guy in the Navy. He was gracious enough to come down to our change of command. And we had a little pre-change of command party, and I'm thinking, and I was talking about how Loogie and his wingman Goat did such a really, really good job. And I'm going, hey, I'm going to pin a medal on each of your chests. And I did, and I gave him a medal. And I looked at my number two man who was going to take over in 45 minutes for me. And I'm going, hey, sorry, Tom, but you got to do the paperwork for this, but we're going to recognize these two, great American aviators and stuff. And so, I just remember it could have turned out worse, and who knows what would have happened, but it was just another one of those situations that was, high stress, but you kind of realize, particularly as the leader, when in doubt, very simple, underreact.
Yeah, underreact. Now, you were able to do that because you had a team of highly trained people that you trusted in. And so tell us about that, though, because that just doesn't happen. Not everyone can immediately turn around and look at a team and they know that they've got it. So how much does your preparation and training of your team really, core to that story?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, we're very fortunate in the United States to fly some of the best airplanes in the world and also have the best trained people. It's also a very unforgiving business in that part of the training is, trusting people, but also holding them accountable. I remember as the commanding officer of the F-18 training squadron, we had some young men and women who really weren't doing very well, and we had to terminate their training. And I remember thinking, I would rather pull this young man in my office and say, I'm sorry, I don't think this is the right business for you, because I'd rather tell you to your face than have to tell your parents at your memorial service, in case something happened in the future. So part of it is, just having that kind of training and trusting them. I remember at one time we're out in Fallon, Nevada, which is where Top Gun, a lot of the flying happened out there. And we're there for about a month. And I'm leading a training flight, towards about the fourth week. And probably about 40 airplanes playing good guys. And as you saw in the movie Top Gun, there's some bad guys. And, we briefed this. And, there were fighters and bombers and airplanes launching, simulated missiles and deception. And I remember when I was done and I'm getting ready to walk out, and there was a reporter in the room. And she came up to me and she says, "Thanks, I learned a lot." And she goes, "How do you know they're all going to do what you told them to do?" And I remember looking at her and I'm going, well, that's a great question. First of all of them probably won't do exactly what I told them to do, because that's why we train. That's why we practice, in peacetime, so that when real hostilities, you've been prepared. Some of them won't do at what you think, but I guarantee you all of them will try to do the best they can. And so you work with your organization and you set standards, that you uphold them to. And I remember, one of the things what I always tried to prophesize to the organizations that I was in is, I want you to be a member. I want you to want to be a member of this team, because of the way we do business, because of, what we hold you to. And it was amazing, Kevin, when you get into an F-18 and you're on the carrier, you just get strapped in. You remember in Top Gun, all the equipment that they wear, and, you strap them in and you hook up your oxygen mask. And the last person that you see, that you shake their hand before you close the canopy, is probably 18 years old. And I remember telling them that, you are the last one that potentially can see me, have an interaction with me in case something happens that I don't come back. And I trust you, and I expect you to do something, and again, they always don't do it, but I think they all have the right attitude and the integrity. And if they don't, we find something else for them to do, but it's a very important key of that is, trusting your people.
Quick question. Are you leaving profits on the table? Discover where hidden profit leaks are draining your business and how to stop them. Download my free report, Stop Leaking Profits, at www.profit.gifts, GIFTS, and start maximizing your profit today. Now, back to the show. Yeah, okay. And I love this idea of setting standards and uphold people to it and keep them accountable to it. And I think the really important thing you said there is, if they're not going to be the right person for this role, then actually we actually need to terminate this particular role, find something else for them to do. And that's, people in business, it's sometimes a very hard thing to do. But, actually you take it at face value. If I don't make this decision now, there's a bigger consequence later. I'd love to contrast your experience with the Navy. Of course, you, after very successful 3 decades, in the Navy, you came out and then worked in a corporate environment with Lockheed Martin. How was it different in terms of like leading inside of a naval organization versus leading inside a business like that?
Yeah, great question. Again, a lot of great people at Lockheed Martin. Like in any organization, some are really good, some aren't so good. Um, that was my first exposure to again, corporate America. And it's obviously very important. Capitalism is strong, as you know about very well, and you advertise how you can help people, earn a profit. And so it was a little different at first working for an organization, that is, number one, they wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to provide the best product, so as I always told people, we wanted it to be an unfair advantage for us, against any potential foe, and Lockheed Martin was very good at that. It was, again, very margins, profit. I learned a lot about that. And again, very important. But the job I had was kind of unique. Lockheed Martin has a center for innovation. And I was fortunate enough to be the director of it, which people ask, well, what does the director of the Lockheed Martin Center for Innovation do? And I go, actually, nothing. I just make sure everyone else does something, and it was good. And really, to make it, very simple, was what we did using the tools we had with our modeling and simulation and our war gaming is there are a lot of smart engineers, technicians, scientists out there that don't necessarily know what the warfighter wants or the warfighter needs. There are a lot of operators who don't know what, the defense industry can give to them or produce for them. And what we did at the Lockheed Martin Center for Innovation, called the Lighthouse, great place to work. If you're ever in Virginia Beach, we'll go visit it, Kevin. Is we bring those two, groups together so that you learn, okay, what can you do? What do you need? How do we make it work? And it's in the spectrum of things that I was exposed to, similar to, when you were with Tony Robbins, you worked with many different types of clientele with different experiences. But I remember, we were looking at, future stuff like hypersonics, and the F-35 and, nanotechnology and really cool stuff. But we're also looking at stuff that we currently have. And I use the word stuff, kind of glibishly, because the new stuff has to be able to play well in the sandbox with the old stuff. It doesn't do any good if they, you got these great capabilities, but you can't work well together. And that's what we prided ourselves, in Lockheed Martin and the defense industry. And so it was a different role than I had in the Navy because we weren't necessarily, yes, we were trying to do the right things, for the company, but more importantly, we were trying to do the right things for the warfighter and the right things for our nations, and we worked with Australia, we worked with the UK, the UK, with the Queen Elizabeth II, she would bring, lots of people to our place and we do war gaming and look at how can she best use the new F-35, which is the newest, most modern fighter, so it was a little different. One of the things that I found interesting was, when I left the Navy, they says, what you'll bring to a team is your leadership. And I go, leadership is, it's easy. It's no big deal, because I've done it. But I found in some cases, I took for granted what I thought people were good leaders, and maybe they weren't. They were, they advanced in the company, great, because they were, engineers and, they made profit and they did all that good stuff. But sometimes I was a little, surprised at either their leadership, personnel skills, their personal connections. And so I remember there were a couple people there, particularly younger people, who I'm looking at them and I'm going, you are brilliant. You have a great opportunity, to be very successful in this organization. If you like, I'll gladly, maybe we should carve some time and we can talk, because, I'm not the expert in anything, but, I am a little older than you and my hair is grayer than you. And I would love to, be a sounding board for you, but also look at things that, okay, I watched how you did this, and I'm going, that's a okay way to go about it, but how about considering something like this? So even though it was a different focus, in the corporate world and in a defense industry, it was still the same because you wanted to do the right thing for the people and produce, the best results for everybody's, and again, if you can help the warfighter and also help the company, it was a win-win.
Yeah, win-win. And I mean, it sounds like it was the same for you because you're coming from the heart and really wanting to make a difference to the people on your team and really serve and support them, which is wonderful. Within the Navy structure, I'd imagine people have been very well trained. You ask them to do something or you tell them to do it, like it happens. Did you find that was the same thing in the corporate environment, or maybe there were times when people just didn't, respond in the way that you would ordinarily expect it in the Navy?
You get the whole gamut, the whole spectrum. I was in the Navy when, I'll use this as an example, when the combat exclusion law was different. It was lifted, and we had some F-18, female F-18 pilots. I'll use this as an example. And people would want to always come up and go, how are they doing? You can tell me. And I'm going, they're doing no different than the guys. There's ones that are really good. There's ones that are really average, both male and female. And there are ones who this isn't their life, and they will be in the Navy until their obligation is over. And the best F-18 instructor pilot in the squadron that I was fortunate enough to command, that was the training F-18 training squadron, was a female. And she could have done anything she wanted. And I'll always remember when she came into my office and she goes, hey, Skipper, I'm going to get out. And I'm going, her call sign was Trigger. And I go, so Trigger, what can we do for you? And she goes, Skipper, there's nothing you can do for me. I want to have a family, and I just don't see this lifestyle conducive to that. And I go, Trigger, thank you very much for your service. So I'm not sure I answered your question and where I went there with Kevin, but really it's, you saw that, in the defense industry too. And, people react differently to different types of pressure. You see that, with, the executives and people that you work with, and, how they do. And some are good and some aren't good. Some need to go do something else. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
No, just help them on their way. I guess know when to help them see that and have that realization.
Yep. It was ironically, I was talking, someone called yesterday who I served with 25 years ago, young junior officer at the time, doing very, very well. And we were talking about one of the problem children we had in our squadron, and I told him, I looked at that as he was very talented, very intelligent. Unfortunately, he thought he was too intelligent and didn't understand his role. And I told this friend of mine yesterday, I go, I looked at that as a leadership failure because he had skills and I wasn't able to bring him into the Ohana, as I thought we should. And I also, this other gentleman I was talking to yesterday, where we were talking about this one particular person, he didn't have very nice things to say. And I go, well, I just want you to know, about 3 years ago, that guy out of the blue called me and said, Skipper, I apologize for not being a good officer when I served with you. And I'm like, I want to drop the phone. And I'm going, okay, what's going on? Is he have some terminal disease or something like that? And he goes, he just realized that, and he felt that, he could have done a lot better job. And I told that to the young man yesterday who wasn't saying good things about him. And he goes, this guy just elevated, his position to this guy because, he admitted it, and everybody learns at different rates. Those that realize that later, and it kind of, again, good leaders, aren't perfect. That, Kevin. And if you try to fake it that you're perfect, your people will see that.
Yeah. So just be honest, be raw, be real. I think that's important. And I love that, the idea that people learn at different rates. I guess in his case, maybe a decade or two, if he had that realization a decade or two earlier, then he could realize, what you had aspired, what you hoped for him to achieve. But I guess It's great if he comes to that conclusion later. So, well, that's wonderful. Hey, Greg, one of the other things we say on the show is that smart leaders have great answers and great leaders have great questions. So what's one question you've asked us had the biggest positive impact on your life?
Yeah, one, that's a good question there, Kevin. Kind of thinking about that, and you're going to be actually, I think, underwhelmed by it, but I think it's very important. And I try to ask this question every single day. And the question is, how did I get so lucky?
Mm.
And we all grew up, and you were a Tony Robbins trained person, and he talks about an attitude of gratitude. And and it's very simple. How did I get so lucky? And it's amazing if you, no matter what's going on in your life, and if you think about that, you'll always find something that you're very grateful for or you're lucky for. And about 25 years ago, I remember I was having a self-pity party. You know, things weren't just turning out, and we've all been there. And I wrote down, everything. Okay, when I was a young guy, I wanted to go. There were 12 squadrons to pick from. I got my 12th choice. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. And I actually did well. And I went down the list and I wanted to go be a test pilot and I wanted to do this and I wanted to do that. And then I looked at this list as part of my self-pity party. And then I looked at it, I go, well, I went to my 12th squadron, because they were the worst squadron around. And we turned them around to something great, And if I would have went to the squadron that I wanted to, we would have went to sea and I wouldn't have met my wife. And then I just took the whole list, Kevin, and went down and go, this is what I wanted, but oh my God, this is the way it turned out. This is what I was disappointed about, and this is the way it turned out. And I tell that to people today, even people who are upwardly mobile, and we all face challenges. But I was really amazed that the list on the right that was not what I wanted originally turned out to be 10 times better than the one that I thought about on the left. I just wasn't smart enough. So I always try to ask myself, how did I get so lucky? And especially when my wife is mad at me, I say, how did I get so lucky? Just to realize I am, and we all go through trials and tribulations and face adversity, but I try to remember that. So that's the one simple question, maybe not what you're looking for at the PhD level, but it worked for me.
It's perfect. It's exactly what I need right now, and it's a question we can ask because we all go through times in business where things are challenging, and we can get focused on the things that aren't working or not going in the direction that we want. But embedded in that question, how to get so lucky, there's a presupposition that you are lucky, and your point is really valid. If you didn't end up in that squadron, you wouldn't have met your wife, you wouldn't have had the children you have, you wouldn't have the grandchildren you have. And incidentally, how long have you been married now?
That was a test question. I'm coming up on 40 years this fall.
40 years. Congratulations. That's amazing. What a great question. How to get so lucky. I'm going to carry that one into today. And I think you ask that every day. I think that's going to be one for the rest of this month and see, because I think that will really shift your perspective and change your perspective about what's going on. So, right, wherever you're listening, make sure you're asking that. How did I get so lucky?
Awesome.
Greg, I could keep asking you questions all day long because I know you've got so much knowledge and so much wisdom, but I do know you've got other things to get back to today. And you've given us some real valuable insights in here already today around leadership. Is there anything else that would be really important for us to be considering as we go about our lives and our businesses?
Great question. It's always be available to learn. Even now that I'm retired, I'm learning all kinds of stuff. I still read, I still learn, and proudly, I have never been the smartest guy in the room, and I'm okay with that. And we've all been around, Kevin, that those who have to be the smartest person in the room, and maybe they are, he or she is, but I was humbled by the people who I worked with, kind of stuff. And so, by not being the smartest guy in the room, I learned a lot. And I had, two basic rules. Number one is, communication, hardest thing you can do. And you see that in your world. And, even when you think you have your communication, wired, well, you still got to work on it, and that applies to whether, you're in an F-18 and you're 4 airplanes flying and you're the most junior guy and you see something you don't communicate to, coaching a rugby team, or into your own personal relationship with your partner or your significant other, And so, rule number one was communication, and so you're always trying to work on that. And then rule number two kind of goes back to not being the smartest guy in the room, is surround yourself with good people. Be able to be comfortable enough with that, and I think, someone said this way before me, Kevin, but, A people surround themselves with A people, B leaders surround themselves with C people, because they're not comfortable enough, with their ego or themselves, that they have to be the smartest person in the room. And, I don't know where I was on the leadership spectrum, but I always prided myself and felt myself fortunate to be surrounded by really good people. And to realize you don't know everything as a leader. And the more you can, be able to accept what others people say is good. I remember when I was a young lad, I always thought admirals were brilliant, Kevin. I really did. But then I became one and I realized, well, maybe they're not as brilliant as I thought they were. But even brilliant admirals, I remember as a young person, I remember going, why are they doing that? And I learned this, I saw this, but I saw it particularly when I got to be an admiral, was sometimes the people around you tell he or she, the admiral, what they think he or she wants to hear, not what he or she needs to hear. And I was fortunate enough, my dad was enlisted in the Air Force. He was a chief master sergeant. And I used to love going in the Navy at every level to go with where our chief petty officers. Those are the senior enlisted. I'm not sure you're familiar with them. And I loved going down and just talking one-on-one, because I guarantee you they would tell you what I needed to hear, not necessarily what I wanted to hear. And so if you can instill an environment like that your people, will come to you, because once they stop coming to you with your problems, you've lost them, And I used to walk around a lot, and I'd like to ask questions, because that's how I learned about them. That's how I learned, about anything in particular. And I remember telling people, if you don't know something that I ask, either say you'll find out, or I'll say, nah, it's no big deal. I don't need to know. But don't ever make something up. Because if you make something up and we find out later that it's not accurate, then for the rest of our existence together, I have no idea if what you're telling me is actually what you think and is right. It may be wrong what you say, but don't make something up. It's best to leave it at, I'll find out, and then we'll go from there.
I love that. It's so important. That trust is so key. And particularly in, the high stakes environment that you're working in, you need to know that the data you got is true and real. And so you summarize that real well. So communication, always keep working on it and surround yourself with great people. And one of the things I really recognize about you is you're very, very humble, very modest in your approach. But everything you said today is borne out in what I saw of you as an example. I remember in one of this interview process I spoke about that we were in, there was 30 of us in this interview process. We had some activity to do. And I think naturally, people look to you as though, hey, you're the leader, you're a leader here. What do we do? And I think one of the things I really remember actually really stood out to me was, I think you took a step back and said, actually, I think, and I don't even know who you pointed to, I think actually this person would be better placed in this scenario to help us and guide us with that. And I thought it was a really great thing for me to see, knowing like you were a leader, you probably could have resolved the thing and done the thing, but actually you recognized someone else in the room who had that skill and you trusted them. And I think that really builds trust. I think that really builds a lot of trust straight away, because then you're not doing it from the perspective of, trying to show off who you are, what you're about. You're doing it, hey, look, this is the best thing for the group. And I think I hear that in your language. You said something just now, and then you corrected yourself. You said the people I work for. And actually, I think that's the way you see it as a leader. Yes, you were head of that organization, but you saw that you were working for everyone, not they were working for you. And I think it's just such a smart way of thinking about things and come from the place of service. So, Greg, I'm so grateful that we've had this time together and that you've been able to share some of your experience. It's is invaluable to me. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Kevin. I enjoyed reconnecting with you. Thank you. I enjoyed our dialogue via LinkedIn and other places. And if I can ever be of service to you, please let me know. And thank you for letting me be on your show tonight.
My pleasure entirely. And you mentioned about seeing the Innovation Center in Virginia. I think I would like to come and take you up on that at some point. So you may get a knock on your door at some point in the future. So Greg, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kevin. Again, have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to Leading to Profit. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. It helps us to reach more leaders like you who are committed to maximizing their positive impact and profitability. Until next time, this is Kevin Lees, and remember, you stop leaking profit when you're engaged in leading to profit.